Welcome to the February 8th, 2025 episode of the Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and today we are going to talk about what is on the lips of every Canadian, and that is the economic summit that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau convened yesterday in Toronto. And the reason we're talking about it is the same thing we've been talking about since January 20th, which is Donald Trump's tariffs that he wants to put on Canada. He wants to annex Canada. I mean, it's a mess, and Canadians are angry, and we need a response. And so the Prime Minister convened this summit. I'm going to talk to Gil McGowan, who's president of the Alberta Federation of Labour. He was there at the meeting, and he's going to give us the inside story. So, welcome to the Energy Show, Gil. Good to have you here.
Hi, Markham. It's good to be here.
Where would we start with this? Where would you like, where does the story begin?
Well, I think the summit itself was significant. It was the latest component of the Team Canada effort that Prime Minister Trudeau has been working on ever since Donald Trump started making his threats about tariffs and annexation. So the first part of the Team Canada approach, of course, was pulling together the premiers. And as someone from Alberta, I can say that it was great to see so many premiers pulling together, enthusiastically joining the Team Canada effort with the Prime Minister. It is sad that our premier here in Alberta is sort of the odd person out. She's the only one who, if she has a foot in the Team Canada camp, it's pretty tenuous. So that was the first part of the Team Canada effort. And then, of course, the Prime Minister also created this new committee called the U.S.-Canada Relations Committee, and it's a committee of former politicians, business people, some labor leaders, and also some trade experts. And so what we saw yesterday in Toronto, the summit, was the third component in this Team Canada effort, and it involved pulling together leaders mostly from the business community, but also from the labor movement. So there are about 200 people in the room in this old converted factory that had been turned into a meeting facility. So just to set the stage, the Prime Minister was up on the stage with the members of this new Committee on Canadian Relations that he'd pulled together to help him give advice to him about how to deal with Trump. And there was a big, floor to ceiling Canadian flag in the back. And so we were invited. There were about 180 representatives from every industry you can think of across the country, CEOs, heads of industry associations, and then about 20 of us from the labor movement, representing public sector, private sector, and I felt quite honored to be in that group. And it was and there was an opening session that was open to the media, and in which the Prime Minister laid out the situation, and then he asked the media to leave, and we had some really frank conversations.
Let's get into that because on the way out, the media weren't even out the door yet, and we had a bit of a hot mic episode
Yes.
where the Prime Minister, not knowing that he was still or forgetting that he was still mic'd up, talked about how Donald Trump, President of the United States, is really serious about annexing Canada. And here's the response that I'm getting from people in my network, Gil. They don't imagine that this is a well thought out approach. There's some sort of strategy behind it. It's more like Elon Musk walked into the Oval Office, told Donald Trump a joke about, wouldn't it be nice if we took over Canada, and then, Donald Trump went, well, okay, that's now U.S. policy. Here we go. We have to take it seriously, but it's hard to take it seriously, to be honest.
Well, that was actually one of the first and I think most important points that the Prime Minister made. And he was very persuasive in making this point. He basically said that we should take this threat seriously. And he actually went on to tell us in some detail about the conversations that he's had with Donald Trump, since they started talking. So this was before the inauguration, and then continuing after the inauguration. And so you can imagine, as the prime minister talking to the presumptive president and the new president, they had some really heated private conversations, and Trudeau shared the details of some of those conversations. And basically, what he told the group at this summit was that it was his assessment that Donald Trump uh, is serious about his threats against not just the Canadian economy, but also Canadian sovereignty. In particular, Trudeau made the point that based on what he's heard directly from the mouth of Donald Trump, this is not really about fentanyl. It's not about immigration, and it's not even about trade balances. Uh, this is about domination. It's about Donald Trump's continental ambitions. And when Donald Trump says that he wants to make Canada into the 51st state, Trudeau is saying that we should believe him. And it's not a joke. And so as someone from the labor movement, we deal with bargaining all the time. And from our perspective, this is a really important point, because when you're negotiating with someone, you really want to figure out what they want. And one of the reasons you want to figure out what they really want is because you have to decide whether or not you want to give it to them. And if it really was just about fentanyl or the border or even balances of trade, then we can have constructive conversations to move us towards addressing those things. But if it's about an attack on our sovereignty, which we wouldn't accept, then the question is not, finding ways to appease him. It's about finding ways to stand up to him. And I think that's a really central point that the prime minister made. And frankly, it's a point that's being lost in our premier here in Alberta and the premier in Saskatchewan as well, who are not on Team Canada yet. And it's actually one of the things that's going to get us in a lot of trouble as a country if we don't recognize that he doesn't really want these things that he says. What he really wants is Canada being a 51st state or a vassal state.
Okay, so there are two things in my mind that he might be after. One is there's always been talk about how the United States will one day come for Canada's water. There are extensive droughts down in the U.S. on the West Coast, down in the Great Plains and south of that. So, and we have lots of water, lots of fresh water, most in the world, I think. And the other thing is with the rise of China allied with Russia, now there's a lot of concern, increased concern about the Arctic, because there's a lot of resources in the Arctic. And so I could see where Donald Trump would say, wouldn't it make more sense if they were just the 51st state? We get all the water for nothing. We just pipe it over the border, and we now have more control over what happens in the Arctic in the north. Is that how it was framed, or is it just simply, I want your country?
Well, in response to the first question from the audience, the Prime Minister did address the issue of resources, and it is his assessment that one of the big drivers behind Trump's new policy to dominate or annex Canada is about access to and control of resources. So he started off by talking about access to and control over critical minerals, especially related to the fact that the world is pivoting towards more of an electrified economy, and that has implications, things like lithium, but then more traditional resources too, like potash, like oil and gas. As a country, one of the great advantages of being Canadian is that we're one of the few countries in the world that has basically the whole range of resources that make an economy go, and we have everything in abundance. And to be honest, the prime minister didn't talk about water explicitly, but in our breakout sessions, it came up over and over again, and members of the cabinet who were there all agreed that that's on the table as well. So yeah, so it's water, it is critical minerals, it is oil and gas. It's not enough for him to just buy the stuff from us and partner with us on commercial projects. He wants control. That's what this is about.
Okay, so there's a lot of discussion, and particularly around Alberta, because Danielle Smith has argued for placating Trump. Give him something, give him a win, And so maybe it's 10,000 troops along the border trying to keep fentanyl and illegal immigrants out. Maybe it's something else, but give him a win. And what I hear you saying is that that's not what he wants. He
No.
wants something else, and we need to address that and get off the other thing that Danielle Smith has you know been
Yeah,
concerned.
and that's my big takeaway from the summit. It's that that what he really wants is not what he's saying he wants. He keeps moving the goalposts. So it's first it's fentanyl, then it's immigration, then it's the balance of trade. Then he starts throwing in things like American banks operating in Canada. All of these things are based on misinformation. What he said about fentanyl and as a pretext for his trade war in Canada, it's a lie. What he said about immigration as a pretext for his trade war on Canada, it's a lie. What he said about immigration is misinformation. Even what he says about the balance of trade is only has a kernel of truth. But outside of oil and gas, we actually have a trade deficit with the United States, and if you take oil and gas out of it, it's pretty much balanced trade. So all of these are pretexts, and so for me, especially as someone from the labor movement who does, like one of the things that we pride ourselves on is bargaining good deals for our members. And so, and I think Canadians have to recognize that what we're doing right now is sitting at a negotiating table with Donald Trump. And when you're at a negotiating table, you want to know what the other side wants. And what they really want is not what they're saying, or at least mostly not what they're saying. The thing that Donald Trump has said that we need to take seriously is this notion that he wants us to be the 51st state. So this is about resources. This is about control. This is about continental ambitions. And frankly, it's also clearly about ideology. Donald Trump reveres strongmen. And I think he has this, and some political scientists have written about this, and I think persuasively. He has this vision of a world of blocks, global blocks, power blocks that are dominated by strongmen. So he wants to be Putin's counterpart in the West. He wants to be our strongman on the North American continent, and there'll be a strongman controlling China. There'll be a strongman controlling Russia, and that's the world he wants to live in. And then, but I think that what we as Canadians have to ask is that the world that we want to live in, and if we're like right next door to this rising authoritarian power, what do we do to prepare ourselves? And there were a couple of other things that came out of the discussion, which I think were really significant too. So first, the thing about about his this 51st state argument, it's a real thing. I think that was the quote from Trudeau. He actually did say that. I was there. The second thing is that even though we're enjoying a 30-day reprieve from Trump's tariffs right now, the threat of tariffs in many ways is already just as bad as the tariffs themselves. So we heard from, like in the large group discussion and the smaller breakouts, we heard from industry after industry where they say that even the threat of tariffs is hurting the Canadian economy. So investment is drying up. People are putting off investment decisions. People are actually losing their jobs already. So it's already so it's not just the tariffs; it's the threat of tariffs. And related to that, I think one of the big takeaways, and this was a consensus among the labor and business people, is that there's no going back. Like the United States is by geography and history our biggest trading partner. We have the biggest trading relationship in the world. It's benefited both countries. But now that Trump has reassumed the presidency and made all these threats against his allies, there's no way that business people in places like Canada or anywhere else in the world can ever trust the United States in the same way that we have in the past. And so that's the big thing that I'm taking away from this is that A, he's serious about his continental ambitions, and B, that there's no going back, and we have to prepare for a world that's going to look a lot different than the past. And that means, diversifying our trade relationships outside of Canada, but also diversifying our economy and figuring out how to make our economy go east-west and support each other within Canada, as opposed to just relying on these traditional north-south trade relationships with the United States.
Okay, so this is a wake-up call.
It's a wake-up call. Yes, for
And
sure.
I would imagine that there
Five
are
alarm fire, wake-up call, red flag, whatever you want to call it.
five alarm fire.
Yeah.
Okay, so I imagine there are a lot of Canadians watching this who are going to be saying, he can't really be serious. This is it really it's a hard thing for one to get one's head around that a country that you've lived beside for, 150 years or more is sudden and thought of as cousins, as friends, as the longest undefended border, and suddenly now they want they're going to dominate you. They're going to annex your country. There's a lot of people that can't get their head around it. What do we do about that?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. First, it's true that a lot of Canadians can't get their head around the United States being anything other than our best friend and our strongest ally. Um, uh, but if you look back at the sweep of Canadian history, and frankly, we're still a pretty young country. 100 years ago, actually, a lot of the pivotal moments in Canadian history were in response to aggressions from the United States. I mean, everyone knows the War of 1812, but even McDonald's national policy when he built the railroad across the country. Why do you think he did that? And at the time, he put up tariff barriers to protect nascent Canadian industries. And so why did he put up tariff barriers? Why did he put a priority on building an east-west railroad? It was because they were afraid that the Americans were going to annex them. So this is new for current generations of Canadians, but Canada has always sort of existed in opposition to the United States, even when we've been cooperating with them. So in some ways, what's old is new again. And we've dealt with these countries, these problems these challenges as a country before. But this generation is going to have to deal with them again.
Now, what was the tenor amongst the business community? Because the business community hates uncertainty. And I'm
Yes.
sure that's one of the reasons why investment is drying up and already jobs are being lost. And so they want certainty back. And how far are they advocating the kind of a strategy that Danielle Smith has advocated, where you basically let's try to placate them, appease them, the Neville Chamberlain approach, or are they, getting some steel in their spine and they're prepared to resist?
Yeah, yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. And I'm glad you asked it in the way you did. Um, because that's actually one of the other big takeaways for me from the summit. And that is that while the business community, which was very well represented at this summit, and basically the CEOs of all the major corporations, the heads of all the industry associations, they were all in the room. And on one hand, it was really encouraging because it's clear that with only a few very small exceptions, they're on the Team Canada bandwagon 100%. So they're anxious, they're scared. Um, they understand that this is a very serious moment in the history of our country and our economy, and they're willing to pull together under the banner of the federal government and the Team Canada premiers. Business gets it that this is serious and everyone needs to pull together. On the other hand, it also became clear to me that they haven't quite got their heads around the notion that things have changed forever. Um, and it seemed to me that they're all still hoping to get back to where we were in terms of our traditional trade relationships with the United States. They still have a lot of hope in the trade agreements that we have with the United States, and partly that's understandable because change and uncertainty are bad for business. Also, they have longstanding relationships with business partners across the border. So, the people that they work with in the business community aren't saying what Trump is. So still have a lot of confidence that their business counterparts south of the border can talk some sense into Trump. But that's where I'm skeptical about them because like putting all your faith in the business community in the United States to talk sense into Trump or putting all your faith in hoping that we can get back to the way it was. Frankly, I think that's a little bit naive because Trump is not a normal politician. He is a proto-authoritarian. He has this continental vision for the country. The other thing I heard from the business community was I heard a lot of can do in terms of getting on the Team Canada bandwagon, but I also heard some excuses about not pushing too hard. And sadly, in particular, I heard that from some of the voices from the Alberta oil and gas industry. I'm not going to name names, but I heard from some prominent people from my province saying that, this is based almost a quote. It's like, we have a very poor hand. They've got us over a barrel. We have to deal. We have no strong cards to play. I couldn't disagree with that assessment more. In fact, I think some of the cards that we have in oil and gas that can be played by Alberta and by Canada, those are some of the strongest cards that we have in our hand. And so when I hear prominent people, purporting to participate in this Team Canada effort, people from the oil and gas sector saying basically we should fold before we've even started the process of playing the game, that's troubling to me.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, we've been hearing that for weeks now out of Alberta, particularly from the premier. And as you know, I just did a show yesterday where we were talking about what Canada could do and how it could use oil as leverage. And I argue exactly the opposite because there are two regions out of the five regions in the U.S. The Midwest, it's called Pad 2, and the Rocky Mountains, Pad 4. And the Midwest in particular, like Chicago, Detroit, 2.8 million barrels of oil a day they import from Canada. But the most important thing is it's 100% of their imports. They have no other sources of oil. So
Yeah,
if
their refineries are totally dependent on oil from Alberta. 100%.
completely vulnerable. And so
Yeah,
if you were going to squeeze a region to get a response, that would be the one that you would squeeze, if
yeah.
you were hitting back. So this idea that we're completely powerless, they have us over a barrel, we have no leverage, I think we need to push back on that because as I demonstrated, and I'm sure there's others for strategies one could take, we do have leverage and we do need to use that leverage.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And this goes back to the first point I made. When you're at the bargaining table, you want to know what the other people really want. And in this case, Trump wants something that's completely unacceptable to us. So if he wanted something that was incremental, if it was a reasonable ask, then we could deal. But when you know that the counterpart on the other side of the table is asking for something that you will never give, and in this case, what he wants is our sovereignty. Then there's a different strategy. Instead of appeasement, you're digging in and fighting, right? And when you realize that you have to dig in and fight, then you have to find the strongest cards that you can play. And in our case, one of the strongest cards that we can play as a country has to do with our resources in general, but Western resources particularly. So, at the conference in the breakout sessions, a number of us were talking about oil and gas, and we were saying exactly what you just said about how the American Midwest, which is one of their biggest economic centers, right? So Chicago, Detroit, the Midwest, it's completely reliant on oil from Alberta. So if we're going to play hardball, and like I don't mix metaphors here, but if you're playing a hand in poker, right? You don't want to give away one of your strongest cards. You want to be able to, play it. And honestly, in this case, we want to let them know that we could play it. And honestly, I hope we don't have to, but I think, either through the federal government, through things like export taxes, or the provincial government through policies like curtailment, we need to make it really clear to the Americans that this is a card that we can play. We can reduce their access to this critical resource that is 100% of the feedstock for major refineries in the center of the United States. They can't refine anything. People won't be able to fill up their tanks to run their cars and vehicles without our input. We have to make it clear that we know this and we're willing to play that card. And I think we need to say we don't want to play it, but if you continue coming after our sovereignty, we will, right? The other resource that came up in the discussion, frankly, was potash. which is mostly from Saskatchewan, but also from Alberta and Manitoba a little bit as well. And this is one of the great things about the summit. It brought all these people from different industries with different expertise together. And I didn't fully appreciate this, but the Americans are basically 100% dependent on Canada for potash and they use that for fertilizer. And so their whole agricultural system can't run. They won't be able to feed people without access to Canadian potash. So those are two of our strongest cards to play. We have to make it clear that they're willing. Another interesting aside is that there's only basically one other place in the world where the U.S. can get potash, and that's Russia. And so that gives
Oh,
us
the
some
irony, the
the
irony.
irony. Yeah, yeah. So I mean, like oil from Alberta, potash from Saskatchewan. Interesting. Well, disturbingly, those are the two provinces that so far are not on the Team Canada bandwagon. And so like it frustrates me as an Albertan to see that our premier is basically trying to deny the rest of the country, one of the strongest cards that can be played to defend the whole country. Like and Daniel Smith is always complaining about how the rest of the country is not doing enough to support Alberta. But in this moment where Alberta can support the whole country, she's absent, right? And refusing to stand with them. So like she wants the country to come to Alberta's defense, but she will not do the same thing for the rest of the country. And as an Albertan, that really I find that very, very disappointing.
Gil, one of the issues that comes up all the time, and this is funny, on social media, people come from all over the world, right? And so a lot of Canadians will be more likely to interact with Americans. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen Americans say, well, we'll just come up and invade you.
Yeah.
And so the question becomes, we say, no, we can't have any potash. No, you can't have any oil down in the Midwest. And Donald Trump says, go up, take it by force. I mean, was there any discussion around in the breakout sessions amongst I mean, we're talking about the top leaders, business and labor leaders in Canada. They think that will happen. They discount that'll happen. Your sense of that?
Well, that threat was in the room, um, and there were many comments about defense. And so there was a general consensus among everyone who was there that Canada needs to become a stronger country by building bonds east-west between Canadian provinces. And that there was a whole range about internal diversification of our trade to make us a more cohesive, self-sustaining country east-west, as opposed to just relying on the United States north and south. But there was also the sense that if we want to be a truly independent country, we have to spend more on defense. And so there was talk about a target of spending 2% of our GDP on defense, which was sort of our NATO commitment. But there were people saying we need to do more. The unspoken subtext was about fulfilling our NATO obligations, but also helping to defend ourselves. And just as a point, there are some really troubling parallels in my mind between what happened in Ukraine starting in 2014 and Canada today. So, and if people know their history, and in this case, I guess it's current events, back in 2014, which is only a little bit more than 10 years ago, Russia did invade the eastern part of Ukraine, and they took the Crimean Peninsula, and then it's sort of like so they occupied like the Donbass and Crimea, and they occupied it for a number of years before they tried to invade the rest of the country. That was a wake-up call for the Ukraine, and they started investing really heavily in defense. And so when Putin came more recently to try to take over the rest of the country, they had invested a lot of money in defense, and so they were ready. So in that maybe it's not quite as dire in our case, but I think there were people there saying we need to spend more on defense so that we're ready to protect our north, but also perhaps to protect our own borders with the United States. So yeah, it did come up in conversation for sure.
Now, it strikes me that if the United States invades its closest neighbor, longest ally, with the intent of annexing it, that essentially you're blowing up international institutions. NATO means nothing anymore. There are all sorts of treaties, the United Nations, and so on. Because I don't think anybody's going to, is Britain going to come and invade the U.S. on our behalf to get us back? I don't
Yeah.
think that'll happen. So that means basically you've blown up the world order.
Yeah.
And do you think that that's what he's actually after?
Well, I'll be honest, this is not a point that was discussed at the summit. But as one of the summit participants, I could say it's definitely crossed my mind, especially when I read about the links between Donald Trump and Putin and the Republican Party and Russia. And I look at some of the um, confirmation, some of the cabinet secretaries that Trump is trying to get confirmed, who clearly have ties with Russia. There are all sorts of red flags from the Americans' own intelligence community. In some ways, it does feel like there's a Russian finance coup unfolding south of our border. And it's no secret that the Russians and perhaps the Chinese would love to see the West, especially the United States, blow itself up. Um, and I think it's probably too early to say that that's what's happening, but it certainly feels that way. And then, if that is the case, that the Donald Trump is sort of this stalking horse for some traditional enemies of the West, that has huge implications for Canada as the United States neighbor. It's not just about economics anymore; it's about geopolitics. And yeah, but that's another reason why I say that coming out of the summit, that one of my takeaways is that we're never going back, right, to the kind of that placid, sometimes contentious, but mostly cooperative relationship that we've had with the United States for decades, especially since the end of the Second World War. That era, that period in history is over. We've turned a page and we're in a new chapter of uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, Canadians really have to pull together economically, politically. We have to find ways to strengthen our sovereignty, strengthen our economy, and we do it by relying on each other, not on the sort of the continental integration that drove our prosperity for so long. I understand why people want to go back to that, but I think that's one of my big takeaways from the summit is that that world is gone. It's no longer in the cards. Going back to it is no longer in the cards. And so we need to look for new trade partners outside of the United States. We'll always trade with the United States because they're right next door, but we need to diversify our trade relationships. But even more importantly, we have to do more with and for each other within our country.
Gil, we've only got a couple minutes left, but what was the upshot of the summit? What's the next step that the Prime Minister laid out and that people were talking about at the summit?
Yeah, I was really pleased to be involved in the meetings because I think the next step is for us to take these conversations out of that room. And it's already happening, right? So, just for example, the president of the Canadian Labour Congress, B. Brusk, uh, just yesterday penned I guess, an op-ed with the president of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, talking about the need to pull together and strengthen our Canadian institutions, find Canadian champions in our economy, build our economy east-west instead of north-south. And so those conversations have started. They were really good. They got started in that room, and now they're going out in the world. For myself, as the president of the Alberta Federation of Labour, representing 175,000 workers here in Alberta, including people in oil and gas, I think that I'm going to do what others are doing because, like a lot of the folks who are there in manufacturing, for example, they're talking about how to defend our manufacturing industries in Ontario and Quebec. I'm going to sit down with our partners here in Alberta to see if I can bang out a credible strategy for two things. First, using the strong cards that we have to help head off a trade war if we can, and that means talking about the possibility of curtailment of export of oil, especially to the American Midwest. And I want to make it clear, I'm not suggesting that we go in that direction precipitously and just turn off the taps. The first step is to socialize Albertans to understand that this is one of our competitive advantages, one of the strongest cards that we have, and also tell the Americans that we don't make us do this, but we can, right? And then related to that, second, we've got to find some way to make sure that we maintain our prosperity and our jobs in this newly changed world where our closest ally is now a threat. And I think there's some really encouraging opportunities for Alberta, especially related to oil and gas. So, for example, I mean, lots of people are talking about building pipelines east-west, but even that takes a long time, and we don't have a lot of time. So there are quicker alternatives to get our oil to markets across Canada and outside of the country via other like the east or west coast. So, for example, we've got pipelines that can be optimized to move more Alberta oil, and in fact, TMX just announced that they could increase the volume that they could send on this new line that the federal government helped us to build just recently. The same can be said going east-west. So pipeline optimization is something that should be talked about. Bitumen by rail is something that we should be talked about. We've done it before, shipping our oil on our rail system, and frankly, our rail system is better east-west than it is north-south. And we could actually like do things like build the rail cars in Canada instead of seeing them built in the United States. So can you imagine that? Well, like cooperation between Ontario, Quebec with the manufacturing center, building rail cars to help our oil go east to west.
Unfortunately, my interview with Gil McGowan was cut off right at the end, so I didn't have a chance to say goodbye to him. So thank you very much, Gil, for coming on the Energy Show today. And I want to leave viewers with a thought. You can see our email and our cell number. Email is the Energy Show, ENERGI at gmail.com. And our text number, and I have to give it to you by memory here because we haven't got our background up today, 587 830-5757. I think I've got it right. If not, send us an email. That for sure we'll get. Anyway, thank you very much. We're going to be doing a lot more on this. And stay tuned. We're going to have other experts on. We'll explore some of these ideas, what Canada could do, just what exactly is the threat from the United States, how serious we should take it. Obviously, Gil believes that Donald Trump is deadly serious, and I kind of think he's right. So stay with us, and we'll see you, if not tomorrow, we'll see you Monday with the next show.